Hello YouTube. Today I'll take you into my investigation of a very unusual case that had taken place in the one of the darkest periods of Soviet history. This case also offers a glimpse into the ancient and forgotten technology that the people in antiquity had possessed, and it will show you how advanced they actually were. So let's take our journey, because it will take you to a number of places around the globe. There was a papyrus in St. Petersburg, Russia, a most ancient papyrus dating back to the pharaoh Senech. We also know him as Sened or Sethanes. This was the name of an early Egyptian king, a pharaoh, who probably ruled around the Second Dynasty period. His historical standing remains uncertain. Some believe that the pharaoh might have ruled as early as approximately 4500 years BC, but most likely it was in the early dynastic period. And that's important because this period was contemporary to the early Sumerian Akkadian civilization of Mesopotamia. The papyrus was lost after 1917, after the Russian Revolution. According to Alexander Kulsky, a Ukrainian writer and researcher, the papyrus described expedition that the pharaoh Senech dispatched to the west to find the legacy of Atlantis. Another papyrus had also disappeared, and it was the Manetho papyrus. It contained the date when Egyptian history actually began, 16,000 years ago. Manetho was an Egyptian priest. He died in 285 BC, and he lived during the reigns of Ptolemy I and Ptolemy II. He was employed at the temple of Sebennytos in the Delta. He knew Egyptian hieroglyphs and Greek and language, and as a priest, he had access to original source material, including ancient records and king lists. So he has a very interesting access. Manetho is credited with 8 works. His most important one, The History of Egypt, was written in the reign of Ptolemy II. His original works have perished. What has survived has been transmitted to us as fragments in about, I would say, a dozen of ancient authors. Apparently, there was a papyrus of Manetho that was lost too, and Kulsky knows about it. Please remember that Ptolemaic period, as I get into the investigation, and remember, that's very important, when Manetho had lived. So let's understand the background of this chronicle. It was quite dangerous to be an Egyptologist in the Soviet Union in the early years of the nation's existence. Soviet secret police had arrested and imprisoned many Egyptologists during the so-called Great Purge. To be clear, through my research, I found out that the scientists had been arrested before the purge, during, and also after. Terror accompanied most of the history of Soviet archaeology. And the legend that 1937, that year, was the main period of the Great Terror, that's not correct. Actually, the most terrifying years for Soviet archaeologists were between 1930 and 1934. We do not know still today the full scale of the impact and full lists of the victims, despite some of the KGB documents that have been declassified since 1991. Soviet archaeologists were arrested, they were placed in concentration camps, some were executed, some were hounded to death, like the highly erudite Alexei Schmidt. At the age of 41, he died. This was in 1935. And of course, his case was just one of many. This wave of repression was generated by a number of reasons. Some of them we know. because they were honest researchers who were not needed by the new totalitarian ideology. They were researchers who did not look at the past of humankind through the lenses of Marxism-Leninism, and who collected artifacts when they were told to leave it alone. The new government did not need to know the past. Kulski suspects that some might have obtained knowledge about Egypt that the Soviet regime did not want them to have. As for the Egyptologists, Kulski believes that results of their research has been classified as top secret. Because we will speak about Armenia, I want to give an example. Ashkarbek Kalantar was an Armenian archaeologist and historian. He had an important role in founding of archaeology in Armenia. He was appointed fellow of the Archaeological Institute of Russian Imperial Archaeological Society, and he was the keeper of the Asiatic Museum in St. Petersburg. He was one of the founders of Yerevan State University. Throughout his life, Kalantar wrote more than 80 scholarly articles. And in March of 1938, Kalantar was arrested in Yerevan by the secret police, among other professors. He was pronounced to be the enemy of nation. He died in 1942. I do not know if Kalantar knew about the events I'm about to describe, but I would not be surprised. And now, let's look at ancient Alexandria. Following the death of Alexander the Great, the center of education and learning in the Eastern Mediterranean shifted to Alexandria in Egypt. When Alexander died, one of his Macedonian generals conquered Egypt and Libya and established himself as Ptolemy I Soter. He founded a great library in conjunction with the museum, and it served as international academy until its destruction 7 centuries later. The end of the Great Library of Alexandria ushered in the Dark Ages. There have been rumors ever since the destruction that some of the precious manuscripts and ancient documents were copied and smuggled out of Alexandria by those who foresaw the imminent destruction. Sometimes the original manuscripts were taken secretly, hidden and stored away in safe places throughout the world. That's very important. In India, Tibet, and as I recently learned, recently being actually more than 15 years ago, in Armenia. So the investigation takes us to Armenia, a landlocked country located in southwestern Asia, bordering Georgia to the north, Turkey to the west, Iran and Azerbaijan to the south and east. The capital of Armenia is the city of Yerevan, one of the oldest cities in the world. It is older than Rome by 29 years. The land of Armenia is one of the ancient cradles of civilization. The Armenian town of Echmiadzin in the Armavir region is the center of the Armenian Church. It is the preeminent pilgrimage destination for millions of Armenians worldwide. The Armenian Apostolic Church is one of the branches of the Oriental Orthodox churches. Echmiadzin is also the see of the Armenian Apostolic Church and residence of the Catholicos. The Church recognizes the Supreme Patriarch and Catholicos of all Armenians as its leader. There was basically a very interesting historical landmark in the town. In Old Armenian, Matenadaran means depository of manuscripts and library. According to the 5th century historian Lazar Papetsi, the Echmiadzin Matenadaran existed as early as the 5th century. It took a particular importance after 1441, when residents of Armenian Supreme Patriarch moved to Echmiadzin. Hundreds of manuscripts started to be copied in Echmiadzin and nearby monasteries, especially in the 17th century. With time, the Echmiadzin Matenadaran became one of the richest manuscript depositories in the country. During the 18th century, Echmiadzin was subject to repeated attacks of hostile forces, At the beginning of the 19th century, only a small part of that great collection of manuscripts remained in the Matenadaran. Now, in 1828, Armenia joined Russia and a new momentum started for this Matenadaran. Armenian intellectuals looked for new manuscripts to enrich their unique depository. Tens of thousands of Armenian manuscripts were destroyed in the countless wars and invasions that ravaged that country, but only some were preserved to the darkest periods of Armenian history. Now, here's what's important. Excuse me. 4,060 manuscripts were taken to Moscow in 1915 for safekeeping, and they were returned back in 1922. 1,730 new manuscripts were added to the collection between 1915 and 1921. Soon the Matenadaran received collections from the Moscow Lazarian Institute of Oriental Languages, the Tiflis Nersesin Cemetery, and a few other places. In 1929, the Echmiadzin Matenadaran was decreed to be the Soviet state property. The government took completely over. In 1939, the Echmiadzin Matenadaran was transferred to Yerevan. Officially, it was done to facilitate the safety and subsequent research of the manuscripts. And here is where our investigation really starts. According to Russian historian Tatiana Samoylova, who in my opinion has excellent sources, maybe even within higher government structures. According to her, when the manuscripts were being moved to Yerevan, one of the persons responsible for this mission was Viktor Arutunyan. He was the NKVD, that was the name for the KGB at the time. He was the officer of NKVD, working undercover, and as a young historian, he was sent to Armenia from Moscow. Viktor kept a diary, and apparently Samoylova had read it years later. She had access to the diary. One of the entries stated that Viktor briefly examined the manuscripts and was shocked to discover among the rolls one that had a map of Martian surface. Moreover, a circumference with a small circle depicted in it. It was drawn around Mars. Obviously, this was a satellite of the planet. But Mars has two moons, and Martian moons are among the smallest in the solar system. The moonlet Phobos is a little bit larger than Deimos, and we'll speak about it more. The NKVD officer was amazed at what he discovered, and he acted very responsibly. He took the map out from the manuscript and put it under his shirt. Viktor wanted to show the Martian map to his high school teacher, and then he would return it back to Matenadaran. The information contained in the single sheet showing the map, it was very scarce. The text was in Latin, but apparently it was a translation from an ancient Egyptian text. There was no information whatsoever about the age the map was made in and who made it. The Martian moonlets, Deimos and Phobos, as we know, were officially discovered in 1877 through observations made at the Naval Observatory of the United States. The map discovered by the officer of the Stalin secret police clearly showed only one moonlet. Why? Viktor eventually sent the map to the Armenian Academy of Sciences and specified where he obtained this map. Soon after that, the World War II had started. It engulfed the Soviet Union, and Viktor Arutunyan was sent to the front. He was missing in action, and his fate remains unknown. After the war, no one heard about the map again, and no information about the manuscript where the map was taken from was ever published. Most likely the manuscript is still in the archives of the Armenian Matenadaran, but we cannot be certain of that. What political considerations prompted the NKVD to send Viktor Arutunyan to Armenia? Was this just the issue of the control? Because they did transfer very important documents, as we know, collected actually many of them in Russia. They sent it to Yerevan. And Stalin always wanted to make sure that he had control over culture and politics of his republics. Did Viktor Arutunyan leave anything else behind? We do not know. I have tried to find out as much as possible about the Soviet secret police in Armenia in the 1930s. Well, after Kirov, the Soviet leader, was murdered, the terror machine was unleashed. That was in 1934 against the Soviet people by Stalin and his henchmen. We know that the bloody reign of terror in the Soviet Union lasted until 1939. And of course, repressions continued in the years that followed. And the Stalin secret police was never idle. That NKVD arrested, imprisoned, and executed millions of the Soviet citizens and foreigners. But nowhere was I able to find out why Horen Muratbekyan, in 1932, he became the Catholicos of all Armenians, why he was allegedly murdered by the NKVD agents in 1938. Was this murder related to, or did it cause the 1939 transfer of the Matena Daran to Yerevan? The first secretary of the Communist Party of Armenia from September 37 to November 53 was Grigory Arutuninov. I mean, that's all I know about what's going on. I know who was the head of the NKVD until 1939. His name was Khvorostyan, Viktor Khvorostyan. And after Stalin died and there was a transfer of power, so to say, he was arrested too and died during the interrogations. So that's about the powers that be. But what about the investigation itself? What about the story that was presented? The files have not been opened as yet. And unless the files are truly open, we can only know so much. We may never know the fate of one of the officers, Viktor Arutunyan, who actually held in his hands the ancient Egyptian map of Mars. But I wanted to continue my investigation. And I found out that there was a corroboration of sorts about the Egyptian map. According to Dr. Alexander Garbovsky, a Martian satellite was mentioned in the explanatory dictionary of Saba Orbeliani. Dr. Garbovsky, who passed away in 2003, was a well-known Soviet and Russian author. His book Enigmas of Ancient History was published in the early 1970s. It made a deep impression on me when I read it in my youth, still living in the Soviet Union. For many people in the USSR, this book was an introduction to the forbidden world of ufology, of paleocontact. That's the Russian term for ancient astronauts hypothesis, and mysteries of our ancient history. I really would love to see this book translated into English, because Garbovsky knew a lot. Sulhan Saba Orbeliani was a well-known Georgian public figure, and author of a collection of moral tales and of the Georgian dictionary. He wrote poems. He traveled extensively in Western Europe, and he was one of the most important writers of the 18th century. He became a Catholic monk. He met with Pope Clement the 11th. He visited the court of Louis XIV of France. He was the envoy of the King Vakhtang of Georgia. Georgia is a relatively small country lying on the southern foothills of the Greater Caucasus Mountains range and on the southeastern shores of Black Sea. Now, it's possible that Saba Orbeliani visited the Echmiadzin in the neighboring Armenia and studied the ancient manuscript roll that had contained the map of the Martian surface. At this point, we can only guess, but of course, this investigation will continue. But meanwhile, let's look at the telescopes of antiquity and other information that may be important to this case. According to Elma Parsamian, a doctor of physics and mathematics, professor and noted scientist at the Burakan Astrophysical Observatory in Armenia, the Matenadaran contains many manuscripts with information about observations of astronomical events, solar or lunar eclipses, comets and novae, bolides and meteorites from the medieval Armenia. In particular, there are interesting information and data about observations of supernovae in 1006, 1054, possible supernovae in 716, two novae in 762. The Armenian scientist lists her sources of information and scientists who had mentioned the Matenadaran in their books and correspondence about ancient Armenian astronomy. She also mentions an interesting discovery regarding ancient astronomy in Armenia, the complex of platforms built for astronomical observations on the small hill of Mezamor, which may be called an ancient observatory. Investigations of the hill show that the ancient inhabitants of the Armenian highlands have left us not only pictures of celestial bodies, but also a very ancient complex of platforms to observe the sky. According to Dr. Parsamanian, the platforms discovered on the small hill of Mezamor in 1966 formed a peculiar complex of an ancient observatory. Sirius was observed and worshipped by ancient inhabitants of Mezamor, and the information they left behind about the star. The planet was observed approximately 2800 BC. This is a very important period in my research, and as I present videos on the same subject, you will find out more, and it pertains to China, to Minoan Crete, and other places that sprung up during a relatively short period of time. Now, Armenian River Mezamor is located about 30 kilometers west of Yerevan. There was a metal producing center back in the 3rd millennium BC. The life there dated from 5th millennium BC to about 8th century Common Era. The civilization at that site was one of the most, at that time was a contemporary of Sumer, and the Yellow Emperor of China, and the Minoan Crete, and the great Imhotep of ancient Egypt, and the mysterious civilizations of Peru. I just want you to know that. Also, among the ancient monuments in Armenia, there was a megalithic monument, probably being connected with astronomy, Zoroaster, structure dating back to the 2nd millennium BC, and it's about 250 kilometers southeast of Yerevan. Now, assuming that Armenian astronomers in the past possessed powerful telescopes or similar devices, they would be able to observe and write down what they saw. We have to assume the same for ancient Egypt. If the map taken by the NKVD officer actually originated in Egypt. Samoylova, the Russian historian, points out Egypt based on the information found in the NKVD officer's diary. However, the more I study ancient history, the more I become convinced that there has been a profound and comprehensive exchange of knowledge and information in antiquity. Of course, there had been astronomical observations without the telescopes too. An example of an observatory before the age of telescopes is the Beijing Ancient Observatory in China. There have been other pre-telescopic observatories throughout the world. They date back to before recorded history. Such observatories provided needed measurements for the ancient inhabitants of Earth to determine when religious ceremonies should occur, how to navigate vessels, how to plant crops. But the Martian map from the ancient manuscript was detailed enough to allow the Georgian writer to make very accurate calculations. Would it be possible to make such a map without using a telescope? However, telescopes did exist in antiquity, by the way. According to a BBC report from 1999, Professor Giovanni Penitato of the University of Rome believes that a rock crystal lens at the time on show at the British Museum could rewrite the history of science. The Italian scientist believes that it could explain why the ancient Assyrians knew so much about astronomy. It's called the Nimrud lens. It was found in 1850 by famous archaeologist Sir John Layard during an epic series of excavations in the palace of Nimrud, the modern-day Iraq. Upon his return to England, he showed the lens to physicist Sir David Brewer, who thought that it could have been used as a magnifying glass or to concentrate the sun's rays. Used as a magnifying glass, it could have been useful to Assyrian craftsmen who often made intricate seals and produced very small text on clay tablets. Professor Petinato mentions that the ancient Assyrians regarded the planet Saturn as a god surrounded by a ring of serpents. This could have been Saturn rings that they saw through the telescope, and they interpreted them to be serpents. The Nimrud land is considered to be the oldest in the world. Another, possibly one from the 5th century BC, another lens was found in the sacred cave of Mount Ida on Crete. It was more powerful, of much better quality than the Nimrud lens. We will get into ancient Crete at some other presentations because there is so much to discuss. But I want to get back to Egypt now. Based on research of several scientists in India and the West, it is recognized that some lenses fixed in ancient Egyptian statues are much older than those mentioned above. Ancient, in fact, first known lenses about 4600 BC. Remember that period. They were mainly from the 5th and the 4th dynasties of Egypt, and they were quite remarkable and unique optical instruments, properties, the properties that they had possessed. These were parts of equally mesmerizing eye structures. These structures were fabricated as separate assemblies for insertion into funerary statues during some brief periods of time. I would say about 2620 to 2400 BC, and also between 1750 and 1700 BC. These so-called eyes appear to follow the observer as they rotated in any direction around the statues. These lenses can be found in the Louvre Museum in Paris and the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. Okay? How interesting that the dates of the ancient Egyptian lenses are similar and as vague as the years of the rule of Pharaoh Senech that we mentioned in the beginning. Ancient Roman writers Pliny and Seneca refers to a lens used by engraver in Pompeii. Famous Soviet scientist and writer Ivan Yefremov mentioned ancient telescopes in his wonderful novel Thais of Athens. It's available in English, and I recommend that you read it if you really want to find out some of the concealed knowledge of the ancients. He mentioned ancient and lost Asian scientific devices, powerful lens among them. Yefremov, who I'm going to talk about in my future presentations, and whom I write a lot about. He was a great scientific personality. He possessed encyclopedic mind, vast knowledge, and a wealth of experience. He had profound philosophical ideas. He kept diaries of his expeditions to Mongolia and elsewhere. And apparently he had other possessions of interest to the KGB, because when he died in 1972, the Soviet secret police sealed off his apartment and carried away his notes, notebooks, diaries, and books. And more. Only recently has some information been relieved. And it's so fascinating that I'll speak more about his findings and his knowledge to the extent available to me. Is it possible that the ancient manuscript that contained a map of the Martian surface was translated into Latin from ancient Armenian and the manuscript found its way to Alexandria? It's a question, but I have no answer. But it very well could be. After all, the discoveries in Armenia of a belt calendar and geocentric model of the universe dating back to the Bronze Era prove that astronomy was well known in this cradle of civilization. Rock carvings of astronomical representation of Sagittarius, Lion, and Scorpio constellations, along with symbols of the sun and the moon, were discovered, according to Dr. Parsamanian, on fragments of rocks older than 3,000 years old. Samoilova does stress that the Latin translation was a later translation from the Egyptian, and I will leave it at that, because we do not have the manuscript and the map. And she has the diary. At least we do not have all of it yet, let's be positive. Of course, the diary could shed more light and might explain why Victor Arutunian was certain that the manuscript came from Alexandria. The two moons or moonlets of Mars, Phobos, which means fear, and Deimos, panic, were discovered in 1877, as I mentioned before. Well, as we can see, the ancients also knew about at least one Martian moon. However, the famous British writer and satirist Jonathan Swift predicted the moon's existence over 150 years before their actual discovery. He did so in his book that is loved by children and adults in many countries, The Gulliver's Travels. The book was written in 1726. And it says, they have likewise discovered two lesser stars or satellites, which revolve around Mars, whereof the innermost is distant from the center of the primary planet exactly 3 of his diameters, and the outermost 5. The former revolves in space of 10 hours, and the latter in 21 and a half. Martian moons are tiny and irregularly shaped. Deimos orbits Mars at an altitude of 23,460 kilometers, with a period of 30 hours and 18 minutes. Phobos, the inner moon, and the larger of the two, orbit Mars at an altitude of 9,380 kilometers, with a period of only 7 hours and 38 minutes. Medieval Georgian writer Sabor Beliani even mentioned the radius of the satellite's orbit, 24,019 kilometers, very close to what we know now. But he knew it centuries earlier. So that's about Deimos. What was the source of the Beliani's knowledge? Jonathan Swift too made very close calculations. He described Phobos' orbital period as 10 hours. As we know, the regular figure is 7.66 hours. And Deimos he described as 21.5. And the real one is closer to 30 hours and 18 minutes. Deimos and Phobos are composed of carbon-rich rock. Both moons are heavily cratered. Some scientists speculate that Deimos and Phobos are captured asteroids. There is some speculation that they originated in the outer solar system rather than in the main asteroid belt. But why did the ancient cartographers fail to show the other moon of Mars? I've written extensively about the mysterious moonlets of Mars in my book, The Soviet UFO Files, and later in the books that I've co-authored with Philip Mantel. And they contain even more information about the failed Soviet Phobos space mission and the persistent mysteries presented by the Martian moonlets. But let's not get into that right now. What's interesting is the idea that had been proposed in the Soviet Union that the moons or satellites of Mars are really artificial objects. Is it possible that Mars had only one moon in antiquity? Do we have anything to fear or panic here on Earth based on what may be going on Martian moonlets? The persistent failures of our Martian space missions seem to indicate that something or someone does not care for our exploration of the planet Mars and its moons. Again, there was only one moon that was found by the NKVD officer when he looked at the map of Mars. According to Ms. Samoilova, it would be worth the time to search for the manuscript in the files or archives of Matenadaran. But she believes this task would be really difficult because the museum moved to the new building and it contained manuscripts. It also contained 1,850 fragments, 2,000 pages from various books, and about 200,000 or more documents about the history of the East. The numbers stated by the Russian historian actually refer to 1960, the year when the Matenadaran archives were moved to a new facility. The pride of Armenia and of the Armenian culture is that Mashtots Matenadaran, and it was named after the Saint Mesrom Mashtots, who was the creator of the Armenian alphabet and founder of the Armenian school. For those who come to Yerevan, they can find it on the northwest hills of the city. And again, this is one of the world's largest depositories of ancient manuscripts. The collections housed there today include more than 17,000 manuscripts on history, grammar, law, medicine, geography, mathematics, literature, philosophy, and other branches of knowledge. It includes almost every sphere of Armenian ancient and medieval science and culture. There are manuscripts in Arabic, Persian, Greek, Syrian, Latin, Ethiopian, Indian, Japanese, and other languages. Can you imagine the treasures inside? Among the manuscripts are works of Greek, Syrian, and other authors whose writings have been preserved only in Armenian translations. The building contains a museum and a scientific research institution, and the Matenadaran exhibits numerous world-renowned masterpieces of Armenian miniature painting. It was reorganized into the Institute of Scientific Research in March of 1959, and like I said, it was moved to a new building in 1960. Through the efforts of the Matenadaran specialists since 1959, more than 200 books have been published. Among them are valuable Armenian sets of works, as well as volumes of the scientific periodical Herald of the Matenadaran. There is a limited public accessibility to the Institute. There are several departments that are dedicated to scientific preservation of manuscripts, research and cataloging of the precious manuscripts, as well as the special departments for publication and translation of manuscripts. They even have the restoration and bindery offices, so nothing gets lost. There are scientists, historians, and many others who use the Matenadaran's cultural treasures for their own research. Sometimes they have display of the cultural treasures. Of most important to us is the fact that there are approximately 300,000 archived documents in different languages stored in Matenadaran's archives, and one of them may be the ancient map of Mars and its moon. I'll tell you more in my future presentations about Ivan Yefremov and some other enigmas of ancient history.